All right. What do you say, Alp? You ready to go?
I am ready.
All right. All right. Well, now we can officially say good afternoon, or 12:01. We'll get rolling here. So thanks for joining us today. Excuse me. Welcome to session number 2 for 2022 of our annual monthly workshop series. Again, my name is Jason Dahl. I am a certified financial planner and a partner at AFS Financial Group. With me today, as always, is my colleague Alp Adebeck. Alp is the founder and managing partner of AFS. And I know we typically have folks tuning in from the AFS 401k side. So just a quick refresher, we at AFS Financial Group operate as a separate entity from the AFS 401k Retirement Services team, but we often collaborate, especially when it comes to our financial wellness programs. I also want to remind folks to please ask questions at any point during today's session. We will keep everyone on mute, but so we ask that you please type in any questions using the chat or Q&A box. Please, at any point, you don't need to wait for a certain prompt or anything. Just go ahead and fire away. I know we got a few questions ahead of time, so we're prepped. We'll be able to address those as we go through as well. I know one of our favorite questions is, can I schedule time to speak with you, Jason or Al? And we would encourage you to directly follow up with us after the webinar. If you have further questions about today's topic or anything else and would like to schedule time to review a few things over Zoom, on a phone call, or in person. We definitely love what we do, and the best part of what we do is connecting with you, people, and helping you solve personal financial planning puzzles. So again, don't hesitate to reach out. So without further ado, today we are diving into what we call coupling your finances. And this presentation serves as a really fantastic overview of some of the key financial planning considerations to keep in mind when it comes to partnering your finances with someone throughout really many or any stage of life. Now, we're going to cover tips on first marriages as well as not first marriages, and really any kind of, I'll say, long-term partnerships, right? And we encourage you to share this information and the recording of today's presentation. We are recording it. We'll get this sent out early next week. So share it with your partner or really anyone else you think may find it helpful. This is also, I'll say, a great session for parents who might be kind of thinking about, if you have a child who's getting to that age of maybe thinking about marriage or any kind of, committed long-term relationship. Some very practical, good things to think about. All right, so go right in. I thought I might start with just sharing a little bit about kind of my story, if you will, of coupling finances. My wife Beth and I, we met in Madrid, Spain in 2001. We started dating later that year and have been married since 2004. I like to describe it as a bit of a blissful blur in many ways, but one important area that we always saw eye to eye on was, I'll say, honesty about money. Neither of us had much of it when we got together, but what we did have, including what student debt I had at the time, was really an open book, and that worked for us. And even though we both took really quite different approaches to how we handle our personal finances, I, as you might imagine, was a little bit more of a spreadsheet, a detailed budget kind of a guy, while she was a little bit more shoot from the hip, keep it in her head kind of gal. But what I really appreciate now is that there isn't one perfect way for couples to, quote unquote, couple their finances, right? There's no perfect, you need to have these types of accounts, this number of accounts, right? Like there's more nuance to that. And I've really learned from friends as well as many clients over many years that it ultimately doesn't really matter if one of you loves to track every expense and one of you loathes that idea, or if you divide expenses, maintain separate bank accounts and separate credit cards, or if everything is shared, right? The most important thing really is finding what works for you, and being honest about it, talking about it, and really finding what works for you does take some time and attention, right? It's not just going to happen just because you're in love, I'll say, right? It's conversations that need to happen. You need to make an effort, and I believe, and I think Alp and I agree. We've talked about this a lot. That this is true not only at the beginning of a relationship, but needs to be revisited, right, throughout a relationship, because things happen, life evolves. So I also like to say sometimes you need to think of kind of coupling your finances like a business partnership with shared goals periodically, right? Like that, sort of put that sort of frame of mind to it. And we'll kind of elaborate, obviously, in a lot more kind of tips and practical components of that as we go forward.
I'll just add a little bit. I think you've summarized it really well. The things that we've noticed over the years it adds on to the characteristics of financially successful partnerships is they really are both very engaged in the process. And what I mean by that is when we're doing review meetings, they are both on the meetings, they're both paying attention, they're both asking questions. Really, really important. There are plenty of people we deal with where we're always just dealing with one half and the other person is really absent and never really involved in any of it. So I would tell you the ones that we've noticed are just more financially successful are the ones that work together. And I'll
For
also
sure.
say that they really are very good about what Jason said, talking openly about their finances, and they really don't hide anything from each other. You occasionally hear stories about, oh, I didn't realize, my spouse, my partner had a bunch of debts accruing, but I think the ones that are more successful just are very open about it and don't have that happen.
Definitely. That is key foundation, really beyond just a financially successful relationship, but just any relationship. So, if any of you have tuned into one of our presentations in the past, which I know some of you have, this slide should look familiar. And I think, one of these days, Alp, I think we could do a one slide presentation with just this slide at some point. But in today's context, I think this is a really awesome place to start as a couple, right? To sort of use this as a reference in thinking about kind of your financial needs. Obviously, this is kind of mirrored after Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We've sort of built this, customized this to be our hierarchy of financial needs. But as a couple, whether you're starting out early in the relationship or been in the relationship for a while, kind of first identify where are each of you on this hierarchy, and are you at the same level or different levels? Because the reality is all of us, Alp, me, all of us are somewhere on this hierarchy. And you may even have kind of 1 foot on one level and 1 foot on another level, right? Well, ideally, we move our way up from the bottom to the top, right? Sort of in a systematic, step-by-step process. But life happens; it doesn't always work in that kind of smooth process, in a neat color-coded order. But here, let me just take a quick moment, kind of walk through it together. Right. So starting with the most basic, as a couple, as a person, hey, do we have emergency savings to cover a minimum 3 months of our expenses, right? If one or both of you, right, the income were cut for whether laid off or injury or just wanted to step away, right? Could you cover your basic expenses for 3 months, right? That's the very foundation. And then you work your way up from there. We're a big fan of HSAs, health savings accounts. We have a whole another presentation just on that subject. But if you're eligible for and you contribute to an HSA, that kind of is a nice complement to sort of that emergency savings component, obviously sort of targeted to medical emergency kind of expenses. And then, thinking about, okay, contributing to your retirement, right? Your future self is going to thank you if you start early and make sure at the very minimum, and this is the best advice you could probably share with any young person starting a first job, start saving immediately as soon as you're eligible, and at a minimum, put in to capture any match, right? Because that's free money. Hopefully everybody likes free money, and you want to take advantage of that. Then, right, that's kind of like the core red and orange, if you will, right? Now you kind of get into the middle and paying off debts. And you might notice that we have a couple different layers or steps of different types of debt. We'll call it sort of, good and bad debt, or high interest and low interest debt, right? And, the threshold for what is high or low interest shifts, right, a little bit.
It has shifted lately, we'll say.
It's shifted in the last year.
Rates have gone up a lot.
Right. But traditionally, I'll say, right, like a mortgage debt, most often will fall in kind of the good debt, low interest debt near the top, and any kind of consumer debt, credit card debt will almost always clearly be in that kind of bad debt, that high interest debt, right? And you want to focus on getting out of that debt right away, right? and ideally, and then have a plan, of course, to not build it up again. And I know we got a couple great questions ahead of time, sort of thinking about like debt as a couple, if one person is coming in with a different level of debt. So I want you to know we will touch on that in a little bit more detail as we go forward. But again, really think this is an awesome reference point for any couple to periodically sort of look at it and say, hey, as we earn more, get a new job, life evolves. Just it's a good grounding point for any, especially younger couple, I'll say, to come back and say, all right, what's the next best use of each new dollar that we have coming in, and kind of thinking about it in this process, and kind of circling the whole thing. And I don't know we don't have it on here, but is thinking about risk management and insurances, and we're going to talk about that as well, right? Making sure that you're covered in the event of an accident or death or so forth, right?
All right. So generally, when we're thinking marriage, they usually fall into these categories. It's first marriage and same level of assets, first marriage with a disparity in assets, and not your first marriage. It could be second or third marriage. But talking through these, I'll say when we see how clients handle their finances, first marriage and same level of assets, and generally it's, as Jason kind of talked about, him and Beth, lower asset levels if they got married, in their 20s or early 30s. Most people just commingle everything because it doesn't really matter that much. They'll have joint accounts whenever possible. They still might maintain, a separate individual account on banking or checking, whatever, but they usually commingle other things. Obviously, retirement accounts have to be kept separate, but when it's a first marriage and disparity in assets, that's generally something that you'll start seeing the prenuptial agreement come into play. And not your first marriage, I would tell you it is much more complicated, especially with children from the first marriage. And people are generally much more protective of, I'll call it, their kids from their first marriage and of their premarital assets. So it really gets a lot more complicated there. That we see separate accounts, we see prenuptial agreements. Thing that is probably most important when you have kids from a prior marriage is beneficiary planning. It's probably the biggest topic we spend time working with clients on how to handle it.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about that. But just a couple other additional quick comments here. Kind of that first marriage, same level of assets. With technology, things have evolved. So it's when Beth and I got married, almost 20 years ago, it was a little different, right? There's not the same level of like smartphone use and app use and the ability to send money back and forth and, Venmo, PayPal, all that sort of stuff. So it was like Alp said, it was very common to it was easier to just have a joint account, joint credit cards. Where nowadays the end result may be the same, but it may be a little bit more common for folks in today's world to because they're just so accustomed to Venmoing money back and forth or so on. So they might maintain separate accounts a little bit longer, but that's kind of irrelevant, right? It's just whatever works for you, what you're used to. But the bigger issue really is, as Alp alluded to, and we'll talk more about, is kind of disparity in assets or debts, right? Kind of disparity in net worth, if you will, and not your first marriage. And then lastly, hopefully this is clear. We use the term marriage on this slide, and we'll use it a lot throughout. But we're really just talking about any relationship where folks are serious enough to be bringing their finances together in some form. All of this kind of applies equally. Obviously, there's some different nuances for truly being married or not, legally and so forth. But so while the 2 slides back, the hierarchy was really kind of needs driven, right? Like making sure you're hitting on your financial needs. And this one to me is a little bit more fun. It's kind of thinking about your goals, right? What do you want to achieve? And as you can imagine, just sort of simple breakdown here, on the left is sort of early stage, on the right is sort of later stage. In the middle, as you have in a Venn diagram kind of thing, is the things that are kind of relevant at all stages, right? And A lot of folks, again, it kind of works in concert with that hierarchy, but the idea of eliminating the bad debts first, right? If you have any consumer debt, hit that off. I know a lot of folks, really want to get out of student loan debt, because the student loan debt is one of those where it kind of can straddle, sort of depending on the rate, depending on the terms. If you, obviously the last couple of years, any of the federal loans have been in deferral, so folks have maybe they've sort of shifted that on the hierarchy a little bit. But that one in particular, and I know we did get a question ahead of time, and I'll touch on that this a little bit right now, is if you're coming together as a couple, and the question really was, well, what if one person in the couple has a large amount of student debt and one does not? Right. And sort of thinking about how to manage that. And first, I would say, it's really great that you're talking about it, and right, you're kind of going into it open and honest. Like, okay, here's what I got. Right. And knowing that going in, that's the first piece. Right. Next, thinking about making a plan together, right? Now that said, because you want to get out of that debt, right, and move forward, going forward. But making that plan together probably maybe just mean that, hey, the person with the debt is going to be the one primarily responsible for paying it off, right? But really, there's going to be some give and take, right? No matter what, because then it's sort of like, okay, because a larger portion of that person's cash flows go into that debt payment. So then you got to think about, are you still going to divide, household, sort of monthly expenses evenly, or are you going to make concessions there? But then I think another big one that kind of gets lost is thinking about sort of those bigger annual, like vacation expenses, right? We've heard folks say like, hey, you got debt that's that's your responsibility, but everything else is going to be split evenly. But another folks, will say, okay, well, I'll sort of make some concessions, if you will, and I'll pay more on the vacations or so forth, right? But it's really all about just like having a plan together, right? Thinking that through together, and then ultimately making sure that you're being really smart about your own financial needs and goals, right? Go back to that hierarchy and say, all right, where does the student debt fall in that hierarchy? But making sure we got our emergency fund, we're paying off the consumer debts, right? We're getting our company match and saving for our retirement, right? Like don't forget that, right? It needs to be in the context of the bigger plan. And we'll talk a little bit later about sort of new debts, right? And credit scores, right? And so you'll need to take into account, is the level of student debt impacting somebody's credit score? And if you as a couple are thinking about getting a mortgage, or new debt jointly in the future, that can impact things as well. And does it make sense to get that new debt jointly, or maybe just one of you? So that's some of the comments on that.
Yeah, I'll just throw in one kind of observation. Sometimes we've seen it turn out bad, and it kind of relates to the question about the student loan debt. What about refinancing the student loan debt and having both names now on it? I'm setting you up a little bit.
Yeah. No, that's a great point, because we've seen it happen, and we've seen unfortunately, refinanced, went from a personal debt now to a joint debt, and then the relationship didn't work out, right? And now, hey, they're both legally financially responsible for it, right? So obviously,
or even co-signing,
or just co-signing on the initial debt, right? We've seen that happen. So generally speaking, keep it separate is kind of the basic gist of it.
Until it really impedes your lives. Like, let's say if somebody has $180,000 of student loan debt, and it really is a problem when you kind of plot out, can we purchase our first home? Then I think you have to work jointly in that scenario to really pay it down as fast as possible to make it more manageable.
Yep. And again, we have an entire presentation just on student debt, right? And thinking about the pros and cons of refinancing or going from government to private loans. And, so there's a lot of various nuances buried within that.
I'll say my last comments are, with everything you said, all perfect. But just summarizing that, at times, really, sacrifices have to be made to achieve your goals. And that might mean reducing the fine dining budget, might mean reducing expensive vacations, whatever it is. I mean, just trying to understand how to avoid turning your wants, things you really want in life, compared to things you really need in life. And so just at times, everybody has to stay focused and do whatever is necessary to achieve your goals.
Yep.
So I got you. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So question we got from a couple different people ahead of time, I think really kind of falls into this category, the idea of merging assets or not, right? And kind of from the practical perspective, the first one is thinking about just bank accounts, right? And again, I'll go back to my earlier comment. Ultimately, it's what works best for you. We've seen folks, in my own experience, we just had basically from the beginning of our relationship, joint accounts, joint checking, joint savings, added, it just worked out better. I added Beth to my credit card account, just had a joint credit card, right? And that worked for us. So as I commented earlier, a lot of folks nowadays maybe getting married a little bit later in life, and even if they're equal first marriage with equal assets, they're just accustomed to the apps they use, right? The budgeting tools that they use, the account interfaces that they use, the bill paying that they use, right? And they just Venmo money back and forth to sort of balance their household books. That works perfectly fine too, right? I don't think there's any kind of perfect answer there. And we'll talk a little bit more too about sort of goal savings, right? So then if you've got a joint goal together, like, hey, you know what, we want to take a really special vacation. All right, maybe you do a joint account for that and put money into there. Or obviously if you're saving for like a down payment on a house, that sort of thing. I'll mention this earlier, right? Retirement accounts always stay separate. You don't make those joint. And then some of the other things to think about, sort of not only of merging assets, right, but also sort of merging risks, right? If you're coming together and you're now kind of taking on, shared responsibility for expenses, right? Shared responsibilities for saving for goals. And what if one of you is injured or, God forbid, passed away prematurely? Do you have the kinds of insurances, disability insurance, life insurance in place to protect one another, right? I think that oftentimes sort of gets forgotten or sort of kicked, the classic can kicking down the road sort of piece of it. I don't know, Alp, what else would you add here?
To me, I always try to focus on the discretionary spending and getting couples to focus on that, to again, go back to the goals, really just trying to understand what's reasonable amount to spend on discretionary spending. And then the one we've probably hammered home a lot on the debts, just most important area is really just the plan to pay off the debts.
Yeah, so great lead in, sort of the dreaded B word, budgeting. And no matter what, right, you really need to know, and not everyone does this, but you need to know and get a sense for how much you have coming in and how much you have going out each month, right? Like you individually and your partner, and then jointly, right? I do think, back to the earlier point, right, having that kind of open book, honest perspective, that even if you have separate accounts, that you can talk about, okay, and review credit card bills on a monthly basis and see, not only kind of holding each other accountable to Alp's point about the kind of the discretionary spending, and are we on target for hitting our needs? Do we have the emergency savings in place? Do we have the insurances in place? Right? Are we saving for retirement and so forth? And I'll say, one of the things that was really important to both Beth and I in our relationship early on was that we were both very simple in our agreement that we're never going to spend money we didn't have, right? And basically that translated to just, we paid off our credit card bill in full every month. That was just standard protocol for us. And I think that is some of the best advice I could share with anybody, any young person, starting on your own, and then certainly in a couple, right? Just don't accrue that consumer debt, and that's, comes back to that emergency fund, right? So if something pops up, you don't have to pay for that on the credit card, right? Again, that's why it's such a key foundational piece of it. But then also thinking about sort of, I'll call it cash flow management, right? Quote unquote budgeting. There's both sort of the practical and the fun, right? And sort of, the basic activities, as a single person or relationship, to be, kind of thinking about being financially prudent. Again, live below your means, pay off your credit card in full every month. But then there's also the savings that's fun. At least I think it's fun, right? Because hopefully you're saving for a reason, right? You're putting money away, not only to cover an emergency if that's needed, but then you're saving money to buy something, right? Go on a great vacation, buy a home, pay for kids' college, buy a second home, or hopefully stop working someday, right? Or as we always like to say, to make work optional someday, right? To give you that financial flexibility. And to me, that's fun, right? So sort of thinking together as a couple to save in that regard, right? To budget towards savings. Like I mentioned before, I was more of a spreadsheet, track all the expenses when Beth and I got together, and she just sort of kept it in her head. But what we realized later was, you know what, if we flip it a little bit on its head, at least it was for me flipping it, and we focus on our goals. All right, if we're putting the money away to hit the goals, to hit our targets, then tracking all the individual expenses were much less sort of relevant or important, right? Because it's like, hey, if we're on track for got emergency covered, paying off our debts, saving for retirement, saving for our down payment, saving for vacations, if we were hitting all those targets, and reviewing it and increasing it annually, sort of what we spent the money on each month after that didn't really matter all that much in our case, and that's worked for us.
So I know one of the things that I'll add, probably one of my favorite lines from my CPA days. Every once in a while, you have to act like a CFO, both parties involved, and just cut out the unnecessary expenses. And to Jason's point about using the spreadsheets, one of the things I think that has become a lot more common use, if not the only use these days, people very rarely use cash, is they have that credit card. And so you get a summary every month on exactly what you're spending. I think it's just a great exercise to review that and decide if did you really need that, and figure out ways to, coming back to that discretionary spending, just to cut out the unnecessary expenses because they can add up.
Yeah. Or I'll rephrase that slightly. Like, is the money you're spending, are you getting some sort of value out of it, right? Because I'm guilty of it too. Boy, just money, all these subscription models, right? And just money going out automatic every month. And am I getting value out of this? I still enjoy the fruits of that money going out every month. And yeah, great advice. Put that CFO hat on every now and then and cut those expenses. So buckets of savings, real simple concept, right? But powerful. We like the idea of kind of compartmentalizing, if you will, sort of thinking about savings in separate buckets or goals, and make it automatic. Right. So if you're building up, trying to get to that 3-month or that 3 to 6 month emergency fund, have it be a separate account, right? Not the checking where you pay the bills every month, right? Because some folks might say, well, I have an emergency fund for half of the month, right? And then it goes down when I pay the bills, right? That's not the idea. Is you move money, you direct deposit it in the checking, move money every month to the savings or a money market account where you're getting a higher interest rate these days, right? And have it separate so it's not as easy to tap into, right? For the non-true emergencies, right? So basic concepts here, but kind of keeping it a little bit out of sight, out of mind. Same with retirement, the obvious piece there. If you're eligible to fund a 401k, 403b, TSP through the government, right? Making sure you're funding there. If you're an independent contractor, that you're disciplined, putting money into your own IRA or SEP IRA, so forth. And then again, I like the idea of a separate account for goals, right? Don't sort of mix together the sort of budget account, right? Sort of the paying the monthly bills account with the emergency fund account and with the goals account, right? Because we've seen it in practice. They tend to just folks sort of pull in, money from each to cover the others, but keep them separate. Set that money aside to pay for that goal of the down payment on a house or whatever it might be.
Right, it seems like I'm getting stuck with just talking about debts today.
Yeah.
To me, probably one of the things that is the happiest moment of any type of relationship is when you eliminate all of the unnecessary debts, where the last thing left, is the mortgage debt. And at some point, if you want, you can always pay that down or pay it off too. But document your debt. And I'll say at times, couples are surprised at how much debts, how much in debts they've accumulated over the years, because it's not just if they've let credit card debts accumulate, they've got car loans, they might have signed on for student loans, either for themselves or for their kids. And when they write it all down and look at it, they're surprised that in addition to their mortgage, they've got huge commitments going out each month, basically before they can enjoy their money. So, spend some time, document it, write down the type of it, total balance, your required monthly payments, the interest rates. Obviously, the big goal is to try to pay off the high rate loans first. I will say some people, psychology wise, like to pay off small debts just to get the debt over with. So let's just say they had a $2,000 debt that maybe the interest rate was a fairly modest rate. If they can pay that off in 2 or 3 months, I can understand how that can make them feel good. So
Right.
sometimes you can kind of work around it a little bit, but the goal is to try to pay off the high interest rate debts first. I'll say on car loans, I just read an article this morning that car debts have been growing recently as car prices have gone up. And one of the things that I can never understand how it happens, because to me it's just not logical, but people that have gotten a new car and basically they were underwater on the old car, and now their lender will let them borrow more on the new car than that car is worth. And I was reading an article about somebody
Mm.
saying that, they just bought a $50,000 car, but their starting debt on it was $65,000. And as you know, today at a much higher rate, I think the average rate right now is 6.9% on a car loan. So focus on avoiding what I will call those type of debt mistakes. I mean, I realize at times maybe you have to have a new car for a variety of reasons, but if you don't, I'll just say at times stick with the older car, get it paid off.
Agreed. And documenting it and knowing, we found this out. Folks just don't know the interest rate on different debts, right, or the balances, and just take the time to just make a summary and know what it is, and then you can reference it back to the hierarchy to know, okay, this one's high interest, this is sort of the bad debt, this is the priority, the other ones I'm just going to make the minimum payments, so forth, right? Credit scores, obviously, a very important component to when you're looking to take on new debt, right? Mortgage, car loan, etc. And you want to know, kind of have a sense, not only what sort of debt someone's coming into a relationship, but that kind of give you a sense for what their credit score is. Anybody ask somebody on their first date what their credit score has ever been asked? I didn't mean to raise my hand saying I've done that. I have not asked on a first date. But it's relevant, right? Especially if you're thinking like, hey, this relationship's moving forward, getting serious, to be honest with one another. Hey, you know what? I had a bankruptcy in my past. I'm still dealing with that, still cleaning that up. Okay, let's make a plan together, right? Because it can, as I mentioned earlier, it can definitely impact your ability to take on new loans in the future, or may impact your decision. I think it should impact your decision on whether you're going to co-sign on an existing debt that somebody has, or take on a new joint debt. Not shockingly, researchers have found a correlation between credit scores and long-term success of relationships. I learned in prep for this that there's a dating app that matches people based on their credit score. So we touched on this briefly earlier. This really important issue for anyone, right? And a question we often get is like, well, for a young couple especially, is estate planning important, right? Do they need to do estate planning? The answer is everyone needs to do estate planning, because everyone should review their beneficiary designations and have a will, right? I mean, that is estate planning. And right, where do we have beneficiary designations? On any kind of retirement account, 401k, 403b, TSP, IRAs, any kind of life insurance policies, you have beneficiary designations, annuities, right? There are a lot of different accounts that you will have beneficiary designations on. And the obvious, right? If you're single and you're funding an account like that, folks oftentimes might name a parent or a sibling as the beneficiary. But then if you get into a committed relationship or get married where you're now kind of financially, intertwined with one another, make sure you update the beneficiaries, right, to name that spouse or committed partner. Same kind of basic idea with the will, right? Get something basic in place initially, right? But then if you're coming together, there's some assets. You probably should,
right? I mean, if you have
any children involved, absolutely sit down with an estate attorney, right? Just make sure that somebody that's what they do, right? There are a lot of attorneys that kind of dabble in estate planning. We always recommend working with an estate attorney who that's what they specialize in. They know your home state laws. Another kind of quick question that we get a lot is about beneficiary designations and wills, and kind of the interplay there when someone passes away. Beneficiary designations will supersede anything you've written in a will. Okay, there was a case that went to the Supreme Court to kind of reinforce this, that if you name a an ex-spouse on a beneficiary, it's going to go to the ex-spouse, right? So make sure you review and update those, anytime you have kind of a life event.
And Jason, on that same subject, we already touched upon it, but long-term committed relationships and even couples, possibly that have maintained checking accounts and savings accounts in their own names, suggestion to change it to TOD, POD?
Yep. Another great practical kind of tip to think about. Now, if you are maintaining separate accounts, any kind of bank account, savings account, investment account, whatever, and you're now married and in that committed relationship, and you want to, for any number of reasons, keep those separate. Alp's point is, okay, if you're not going to make them a joint account, right? Because if one of you passes away in a joint account, the other person just steps in and it's their account. If you're going to keep them separate, consider adding a TOD or POD, passable on death or transfer on death, which is basically just means adding a beneficiary designation to a non-retirement kind of account. Again, that will supersede anything you've written in the will. Just keep that in mind. You might have certain accounts that you've said, hey, and we're going to talk about this on the next slide a little bit. Maybe you inherited money, right? Or you said, hey, this particular money is earmarked for a sibling or someone else, right? So you want to keep that in mind. And maybe you name the TOD to that sibling, right? Or another family member. But that's can be a really valuable practical tool to incorporate into account registrations for sure. So when things get a little bit more complex, all right, and what do we mean by this is, and I'm just going to kind of use the example we get asked a lot: do I need a trust? All right, it's that is a component of estate planning. It's not for everyone. Not everyone needs a trust. A lot of folks do benefit from incorporating a trust into their planning. And in our context here, I think the biggest sort of scenario that we see where trusts are valuable is that second marriage, blended families. All right, that's usually a pretty clear case where a trust can be valuable. And why is that? And the idea being that I'll just use the example. Getting married, each person in the marriage has kids from prior marriages. You're coming in with your own sort of assets from your previous lives before getting married, and you might say, hey, if I were to pass away, I want my new spouse to be protected. Right. But I ultimately want my assets that I've accumulated in my life up until this point to go to my kids. Right. So basic kind of scenario we see oftentimes. So you might say, if I pass away, I want my assets to go into a trust. The trust may simply say something like, hey, help take care of my spouse, right? Let them maybe draw on the income, help, cover expenses during their life. But don't let them sort of draw it all out and use it. What if they get remarried? All right, that sort of thinking. That ultimately, then, when that spouse passes away, the money goes back to the kids. I'm kind of oversimplifying, but yeah.
In that scenario, one of the things that becomes a really useful tool is life insurance, depending on the age somebody is in that second marriage and their insurability. But it really solves a lot of the problems if you can get reasonably priced life insurance in place to protect the spouse in the event of an early death, while also making sure that your assets go where you want them to go to. And one that I think that's actually come up probably a lot more frequently lately is that second marriage, or called third marriage, late in life. Where we see 80-year-olds, 90-year-olds getting married. It's very complicated. And I'll say, typically the adult children get involved because they're worried about protecting their future inheritances. It sounds kind of strange, but they just want to make sure there's a plan in place if older parents are actually getting married.
Yeah. I'll add just a little bit kind of to the strategy of life insurance in that kind of scenario. It can solve a lot of problems. Again, assuming you're insurable, can get a policy at a reasonable price. But kind of a common strategy is because of the way kind of the tax rules work. You might say, hey, if I pass away, I'm going to name my second spouse the beneficiary on my retirement accounts. And as long as I have this life insurance in place, that I name my kids, right, the beneficiary, right? So it kind of makes everyone whole in that example. And that's a kind of a common way.
Thinking through the process. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Alp, What about when somebody inherits money? What are some of your comments or tips to consider?
So I'll say in coupling your finances, probably the most uncomfortable discussion that we frequently have when somebody inherits money is that it's the proper protocol for them. Again, I'll say if it's meaningful, to keep that money segregated, because it allows them to control in the event that something happens to the marriage down the road. And what I mean by keeping that money separate, so let's say somebody inherits $1 million, they can actually keep that money just in their name. And I jokingly will say have a one-way door on the account, which means that money can come out of that account, but money can't go in it, so they don't contaminate that pile of money with
joint
family
money.
assets. But it's advisable to keep it separate. And that way, in the event of a untimely divorce, right, you can basically protect it as your asset. It's not split.
Yep. I had this conversation with my parents. My parents been married 50 years. My grandmother recently passed away. My dad's mom. My dad inherited a little bit of money, and then I told him in front of my parents, "Hey, Dad, I'd give you the advice I give any client. You know, inherited money. If you commingle it, if the marriage dissolves, and for any reason, it's quote unquote contaminated, to use Alp's word. But just something definitely to think about. So we've talked kind of about insurances throughout today's conversation. So the big thing, I mentioned this earlier, liability I didn't really talk about before, right? But that's relevant at any point in life, right? Thinking about making sure you got the proper coverages for your car, your home. Umbrella coverage is one that folks often overlook, and is just that additional layer of liability coverage that goes above and beyond home and auto liability coverage limits. Life insurance we've been talking about quite a bit.
And Jason, I'll also say on the life insurance for the non-married long-term couples, I think that's something that we see often get overlooked because they're just not thinking along those lines, and they just have never put policies in place to possibly allow the surviving spouse to maintain the household.
Yep. And just a quick comment there. Typically, what you have through your employer is not sufficient, I'll just say, right? Because that's usually maybe 1 to 3 times your salary, when you might be hedging the risk of loss of 10, 15, 20 plus years of salary if something were to happen to you. And 2 is typically not portable, right? So what if you're out of work and not with that employer for some period of time? So it's oftentimes advisable, get your own policy, right, that you kind of control. Disability.
Just also add to that, just you never know if you develop some health ailment that you become uninsurable at a young age. And so if you've been relying on the employer coverage and, oh, I switched jobs and now I need my own coverage, and you are now uninsurable, that's a problem.
Yeah. Quick comment on disability. If you're on the hierarchy where you've got that 6 months of emergency savings, you're comfortable there. Short-term disability becomes much less relevant, right? Because you can afford to cover short-term loss of income. But really, for anybody, you should make sure you have proper long-term disability coverage in force. And again, the same kind of idea. A lot of times, folks will say, "Oh, I have that through my employer." But that may not be sufficient, right? So a lot of times it's recommended that you consider layering on additional kind of private long-term coverage, long-term disability coverage. And then long-term care insurance is a subject that gets a lot of coverage these days. And I'll kind of put it in the context of second marriages, maybe marriages later in life. This is another way of saying, well, where the adult kids might get engaged in here to say, well, gosh, well, what if the new spouse needs care, and my parent, right, is now going to be draining their assets to pay for that care, or vice versa, right? And so there can be a sort of a family conversation to say, and we sometimes see it where the kids help pay for the insurance policy, the long-term care insurance policy, again, to hedge that risk as kind of a form of almost portfolio insurance, right? To sort of protect the assets in the event that there's that care need that can be very expensive.
Good summary, Jason. So maximizing your employer benefits. This is probably one of the simpler slides. It's just a very common sense slide. Think of like 401k matching formulas. Sometimes we see couples with one person maximizing their 401k and the other one might be working part-time and not maximizing, not putting any money in the plan at all. So make sure you take advantage, as Jason mentioned earlier, of all the free money available in the 401k plan. So if there's a match there, make sure both are actually taking advantage of that and getting all the free money. You also want to evaluate the health plans available and just make sure that you've reviewed the single coverage, family coverage of the various employers and take advantage of the one that makes the most sense for your situation, and other employer benefits like flexible savings accounts, health savings accounts. Make sure you consider them all and basically factor it into your family planning.
Yep. Yep.
And we talked a little bit about this, as Jason was talking about, if you're taking care of other people in the family now, but so the multi-generational household. So think of almost call it the modern family today. You could end up having adult children living with you, and you can also have your parents either living with you now, or you're fairly confident that one of them will live with you later. So,
or that you're just simply financially responsible for
right?
either way.
It may not be in your house; it might be in another household. And then we
Yeah.
frequently see that where somebody says, "Oh yeah, we're paying $1,500 a month to our parents just to help them make ends meet." So, what are some of the costs that you have to consider there? Think of adult daycare, nursing home care. All of that is something that has to actually be thought of, as a couple. Like, what are some of the expenses we could be hit with later? Again, the adult children, the kids that haven't launched successfully, can be very, very expensive.
And I'll say again, those sorts of expenses, talk about it with the new person. If you're coupling your lives together, coupling assets, coupling potential future expenses, to say, hey, do you think you might be financially responsible for one of your parents or for an adult child, right? If you're coming together later in life, right? Again, not judging that things happen, right? But just talk about it. Be open that it's not a surprise, because we've heard folks have said, yeah, I've kind of committed, I'm in this relationship, and now I'm just finding out that we're going to be paying for my partner's, mom or dad or, so forth. So
it's kind of that evaluation process. Oh, you've got student loans and we're going to have to pay for your parents to live someday.
Right.
It's up to you, that part, but
yeah, yeah. We've really I think we've covered this in a lot of different ways. I know we did get a couple questions on this. This is probably the most common question we get. Anything else in your mind that you would add to here?
Yeah, I think probably more on the long-term committed relationships. Like, how do you handle this? I would say that the thing that we worry about is if somebody in a long-term committed relationship puts a lot of their money into a joint account, and let's say one side funded most of the account balance, they could be in a situation, if something happens to that relationship, the other person beats them to the account and drains it. I've seen it happen, heard it happen many, many times. So just make sure you protect yourself there in terms of, if you've accumulated a good amount of assets and you're in a long-term committed relationship, you don't want to make all of your assets vulnerable in the event something happens in a relationship.
Yeah. And I'll add to, I know we talked about that you have to keep retirement accounts separate, right? So you're never going to make a joint retirement account, but there's oftentimes relationships where one person might be out of the workforce for a period of time for any number of reasons, and not necessarily eligible to fund a retirement account. But my point is sort of thinking about sort of merging the goals for retirement. So making sure that even if someone's not eligible to contribute to a retirement account, that they're still funding for retirement in some way, right? That with the joint or with the single income in that case, funding an IRA at a minimum, right? So thinking about, okay, hey, I can't fund a 401k, but I can at least fund an IRA. Can you put money in a SEP if you're doing some consulting? Can you just fund a non-retirement account that is in your mind, that, hey, this is earmarked for retirement, right? So we sometimes see that get sort of lost in the shuffle, if you will, that, we just sort of forgot to fund retirement for one spouse because they were out of the workforce for a while. So yeah.
I think we've talked about quite a few of the top tips. I would actually say that what Jason started out with, like, be open, work together, set goals, and then develop a plan to basically achieve your goals. I mean, it's pretty straightforward there.
Yeah. At any stage of the relationship. It does get perhaps a little bit more, kind of risky, if you will, right? If there's when you get into that disparity of assets, just kind of thinking about, okay, how do I, kind of not only protect, not even thinking about it selfishly, right? Like, oh, I need to protect the assets that I'm coming into the relationship, but just thinking about the health of the relationship, right? That, hey, I want to be honest, I want to be open with you, that we're coming into here at different levels, right? So I'm just kind of being prudent in some regards, and we've seen it. We've sat at the table where folks have said, what, we've kind of struggled talking about this on our own. It's helpful to have a sort of neutral third party. And so Alp and I have been at those tables, had those conversations where we can just kind of be straight to the point, matter of fact about, okay, here's sort of some of the potential risks, the pros and cons, thinking about, right, things to consider. And so whether it's sitting with a financial advisor or so, any kind of, trusted, sort of neutral party can be very valuable.
Sure. So Jason, I'll add to that by saying, I think one of the things that we've noticed a lot over the last 4 to 5 years is the parents are now, I'll say well-off parents are now much more involved in this situation.
In this situation.
And they actually do a lot of planning on their part to restrict assets down the road, basically in the event that their child's marriage dissolves, that they've done a lot of planning to make sure that the assets stay on their child's side of the ledger. And on the subject of a prenup, which we've been involved in a lot of those discussions, I would say the best advice is have that discussion early, not late, not 3 weeks before
the wedding
date. So just get that out of the way, and it's really not an issue if you can talk about it rationally.
Yeah. And great points. And that disparity in assets might not necessarily be at the level of the two people getting married. It might be at the level of the family assets, to Alp's point, right? And so the parents who might recognize, hey, we have more assets than the family of the other, spouse coming into the relationship, and so they want to just be prudent and smart about how they go about maybe gifting. Okay, hey, or if we want to gift, are we just going to gift money that then we know is going into a joint account? So then there's really no sort of unwinding that, or does it go into a joint asset? Oh, we're gifted the money and they bought a house together. Again, that doesn't really come unwound, right? It's going to be split in a divorce, right? So just, we have a lot of those conversations from again, the parent perspective. So I'm glad you brought that up, Al. And then, we've talked a lot about this. We have a lot of conversations here, and, for the most part, folks that we talk to are pretty prudent, right? Thinking about this, like, hey, I want to protect my family. You want to protect your family, but we also want to protect one another, right? So how do we go about doing that? Life insurance can oftentimes be a great tool to rest assured that, hey, everyone's going to be taken care of. Beneficiary designations, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. You can have, split 50-50, right? Different percentages. You could have one account going to one person, another account going to the kids. Right? There's a lot of different components that go into that, but it's prudent to not only sort of think about it financial planning wise, asset, wealth management planning wise, but also the estate planning piece of it, right? Like, okay, what do we do while we're alive? What if one of you needs care, right? Who's going to pay for that? Oh, let's make sure we both have long-term care insurance. And then what if one of you passes away, right?
Remember, any of these plans, they can be updated, right? So you can revise things, and we see that done quite frequently, especially, I'll say, not your first marriage. And after it's gone on for 20, 25 years, you do see some people at times start merging things more, and there's a trust factor that gets involved.
Yeah. And the kids are now grown and settled, and right, there's maybe not as much concern of, hey, I need to take care of my kids to help them if something happens to me, right? So it's a constant evolution for sure. So before we go to the last handful of slides, I just want to go back, make sure some of the questions that we covered here. Recommendations on couples having separate and or joint accounts. If there's anything we didn't cover there, please follow back up with us on that. When it comes to money, what should every couple discuss with each other before and after marriage? We've talked a lot about that. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that here in just a moment. Have an idea there. Combining finances, right, for non-married long-term partners. There's I think we've hit on a lot of that, right? The joint accounts versus individual accounts, so forth. But again, I love the hierarchy as a great reference point, but just make sure that, hey, you're each going on, making sure that you're saving for retirement, you've got the emergency fund. It's kind of the same basic concept. If the relationship doesn't work out, that hey, we've got these shared debts, we got these shared assets, but I also have my own, level of assets. So, yeah, great. So I know we're coming up on the hour, and so I think we're doing well for time. So starting that money conversation. So yeah, I love that. Love the question we got. So sort of what should you talk about as a couple? I'll say
we've given you a lot of ideas.
A lot of ideas, but this one, I think this question right here can be really helpful to start that conversation. You're just kind of thinking about how did you, right? Your partner you're talking about. Well, what was the relationship with money growing up, right? Sort of how did your parents, what was that in the household? Did they talk? Did they include you in any conversations as you got older, and the ability to understand it? Was it stressful? Right? Was there a divorce in that family, right? Just how did that impact the finances? Because the kind of, I'll say, unfortunate reality for most Americans is that's where they learn pretty much everything they know about money, because it's just not a regular curriculum item in high school and college, just basic personal finance, right? So most folks kind of learn about money and develop their own money habits from what they observed in the household. So I think this can be a really great way to kind of jumpstart that conversation. And even if you've been in the relationship for a while and maybe you've been struggling to try to get over that hump to have a more meaningful conversation. Again, I think this can be a great kind of framing question for that.
Great.
So, hey, I mentioned throughout today's presentation that we cover a lot of different topics. We've got webinars on HSAs, on insurances, on retirement planning, on many other subjects, investing. We do quarterly market updates. So please check out our website for any recordings. We've got handouts, infographics. We have a handout that goes with this presentation that, again, can be really helpful as a couple. Looking at that together can help kind of facilitate the conversation. We'll be sending that out with the recording, so you'll get the recording in the handout early next week. And here's our great team. Please don't hesitate to reach out. Just make sure I covered all of the questions. I think we did. Yeah, so please let us know if you have any questions, comments about today's presentation or anything else. We'd love to connect with you, and hope you have a great rest of the day.
All right. Take care, everybody.
All right. Be safe.